thank you very much for coming out this evening and to discuss this topic of whether or not we have a new Cold War brewing with Russia and what that might entail. Before I start, since as George mentioned, I do teach at the U.S. Naval War College, so I have to give you my disclaimer. My remarks tonight will be my own personal opinions and assessments. I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. Navy or the Department of Defense. They may or may not agree with the things I have to say. And since George gave you some of my other affiliations, if you like my talk, certainly send praise to the War College. If you don't like it, then complain to FPRI or the National Interest. Usually with talks of this nature, and I've observed, been invited to and sat through a number of them in the past year, there's a pattern that we see that develops. So people come in, they talk about there are problems in the U.S.-Russia relationship. Depending on the speaker's proclivities, they might blame the United States more or blame Russia more for the breakdown. And then they wrap it up with, but despite all of this, there is a bright future ahead for U.S.-Russia relations because of all the interests that bring us together. I don't share that optimism, so I'll just come out front and say U.S.-Russia relations right now are bad, they are deteriorating, and I don't see improvements coming anytime soon. This is a cold, hard reality that I think we all need to get used to. Now, the optimistic note. I'm not saying that when you leave here tonight, you go home, dig a bomb shelter, start stocking up on canned goods and waiting for the inevitable nuclear apocalypse. We're not reaching that level. And so in some ways, when we talk about a new Cold War, we default back to the old Cold War and assume that what we're talking about is two nuclear-armed superpowers at a hair's trigger's notice waiting to launch devastation on each other. So when I talk about a new Cold War potentially between Russia and the United States, I'm not worried at that level yet. We're not at that stage of being once again on a hair trigger alert for a nuclear conflict. But what it does mean is that all of the optimism of the last 25 years that there could be an effective partnership between Russia and the United States, and more noticeably that Russia somehow is going to be able to help the United States solve some of the most pressing problems the U.S. faces, and thus help take some of the costs and burdens off Washington's shoulders, that's not going to happen. And in fact, Russia is incentivized now to continue to be a spoiler for the United States around the world, and I'll get into why that's happening momentarily. I had the honor of speaking to the World Affairs Forum here 10 years ago. I don't assume that anyone here was at my talk then a decade ago, which then allows me to recap parts of it, because in some ways I could take that talk from 10 years ago and give the same talk tonight. All I need to do is change a few names, a few personalities, a few dates, but otherwise I could have gone back and essentially given you the same speech and for twice be able to get paid, not paid in a literal sense, as you heard me, we were volunteers to speak here, but in the sense that I could have given the same talk without having to prepare. And what I mean by that was that 10 years ago I said that the United States had a problem with its approach towards Russia. So in 2007, we had two issues that we had not solved since the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the First Cold War. And the first was that the U.S. policy, national security policy establishment never settled on the question of what role Russia ought to play in the world and what role Russia playing in the world was acceptable to the United States. So you had some who essentially said, wouldn't it be great if Russia just simply disappeared as a great power altogether? And there were people circa 2000 writing that Russia is finished, Russia will never rise again, it will never be a great power, we have nothing to worry about. Russians decided not to follow that script. They decided that they were going to try to resurge as a great power again. And as that resurgence began in the 2000s, the U.S. national security establishment, which got very used in the 1990s to America as a unipolar power. So China was looking inward, the Soviet Union was gone, the European Union was busy trying to figure out what it meant to be a union. India and Brazil had not yet started their rise. The U.S. kind of looked at the world of the 1990s. This is a pretty good world from the perspective of American policymakers. Don't know, George, if Joseph Joffe ever came to speak up here in Stanford, but he coined this as a German defense and national security intellectual. He coined the term that, America in the 90s was a hub and spokes world. That you had Washington, the United States in the center, and every part of the world had to connect into the United States, and the United States defined the international system that way. We got used to that. We got used to what Charles Krauthammer called the Unipolar Moment, where the United States had a preponderance of influence, political influence, military influence, economic influence in the world. When Russia started to resurge, then the question was, where does Russia fit into this? And we weren't able, as a national security establishment, among ourselves in the United States, to come to an answer of, what does this mean? What can we live with? That was the first problem. Second problem that we had from the 1990s onward was we never established for ourselves the question of, to what extent how Russia runs itself internally is a matter for the United States and for American foreign policy. So how Russia governs itself at home, to what extent is that a factor in how the United States should deal with Russia? To what extent should we, ought we, to become involved in domestic Russian politics, shape Russian domestic politics, or insist that Russia have to govern itself domestically in a way that would meet with American approval? We never definitively answered that question either. So when I was here in 2007, was asked about the question of when we began to see the first signs of the U.S.-Russia relationship going through some serious deterioration. That was the year that President Vladimir Putin went to Munich and really shocked his audience by essentially saying, Russia is back, Russia doesn't like the shape of the world, Russia doesn't like the role it's been assigned in the world post-1991, and Russia may be seeking to change or alter those terms. It was a very shocking speech. Certainly caught a lot of the attendees there by surprise. Certainly Defense Secretary Gates at the time, Senator McCain and others were taken aback by that speech. It's where Putin used the famous phrase about describing the United States as Comrade Wolf, who goes out and devours what it feels like devouring and essentially wants to keep the sheep in line, but rules for the wolf are different. That was a signal that perhaps things were beginning to change, and it was a warning shot that Russia might not continue to follow the course that the United States had charted out for it. And the problem the U.S. national security establishment had in responding was we didn't know exactly how and where should we oppose, where should we accommodate, and we had a split in the U.S. national security establishment, which has persisted pretty much to the present day. It persists both within Republican and Democratic administrations. It persists in the Department of Defense and the Department of State. Russia engagers and Russia skeptics. So engagers say one of two things. Either Russia could be a natural partner of the United States and the U.S. ought to engage, or the U.S. has bigger problems in other parts of the world, and therefore some accommodation of Russia is useful if it allows the United States to concentrate on more pressing problems elsewhere. Russia skeptics tend to either say Russia, under its current form of government, is going to be problematic for the U.S., it's not going to be an effective partner. Another camp of the Russia skeptics looks out and says that Russia, by its very nature, the type of state that it is, the type of geography that it occupies, the things which drive the Kremlin, doesn't matter who's in power, czars, commissars, presidents, that there are certain geopolitical imperatives that as long as Russia is Russia, it will bring it into conflict with the United States and the Western powers. So you had these camps in the U.S. government, and what you always had was they were checking each other. So Russia engagers would propose, let's do an engagement of Russia, let's do a reset, let's do programs here. The skeptics would come out and say, well, what about democracy in Russia? What about Russia's relations with its neighbors? And you had a thing where the U.S. national security establishment never presented a unified perspective on Russia. So different parts of the U.S. government might try to have different initiatives. So in the Bush administration, you had a Russia engagement wing in the National Security Council staff and in places like the Department of Energy. You have Russia skeptics in the Department of Defense and in some parts of the Department of State. President Bush would propose initiatives and then would find that the US bureaucracy found ways not to move on them. President Putin had a similar issue because he had his own American skeptics in Russia. And so we had problems with the relationship. So when I was here a decade ago, I was laying out this story. The Obama administration ran into some of the same issues, that you had both Russia engagers and Russia skeptics. You had an effort to try to reset relations on the one hand, but then you had a whole list of unsettled questions which prevented the relationship from moving forward. And in both cases, in 2008, with the Russia-Georgia war, in 2014 with the incursion into Ukraine, these events generally had a negative impact on the relationship. The problem that we have now 10 years later is these questions, as I said, are still unsettled. What role should Russia play in the world that's acceptable to the United States, that we're willing to live with? And what extent is Russia's internal governance a matter for American foreign policy? But what's changed over the last decade is the wiggle room for an American president has contracted dramatically. So 10 years ago, let's take the question of Ukraine and whether or not Ukraine should become a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. 10 years ago, a United States president had a degree of wiggle room on that question. We could say, well, Ukraine could be a member of NATO, but it doesn't have to be. You had room for bargaining and negotiation. Since then, it is now a matter of US law. US law commits the United States government to seek the entry of Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova into NATO. Now, what gets us off the hook and what got the Obama administration off the hook for a while is that if the governments of those countries don't want to be in NATO, we're not going to force them into NATO if they don't want to join. And the Obama administration reset to Russia actually benefited a great deal from the election of Viktor Yanukovych as president of Ukraine in 2010, because it got the United States off the hook. Because now we can say, well, we're certainly happy to have Ukraine in NATO. If the Ukrainians don't want to be in NATO, then we don't have to act on that legislation. Obviously, since 2014, many people in Ukraine want to be in NATO for for very understandable reasons. And so the United States is committed. Doesn't mean the United States has to act on it, but it does mean that if a president, President Trump, or a future U.S. president wants to compromise on that, it requires the U.S. now to have to backtrack from a position that it has staked out, which then makes it look not like a compromise, but it looks like a concession, or it looks like failure. And that's a lot harder to get through the Washington policy process, to say, well, we're going to go against statute, particularly then if Congress says, we passed that law, why aren't you following it? Our ability to negotiate with Russia to try to want to be very much deal makers, right? We want to go out and try to strike bargains with Russia. In 2007, the president had a great deal of leeway to do this. There were some sanctions on Russia that were extant from the Cold War, the Jackson-Vanik sanctions, but those had provisions for presidential waivers. So all the president had to do was to certify that Russia was in compliance with the Jackson-Vanik restrictions, which had to do with, are you letting people emigrate, which Russia was, and do you have a market economy, which Russia was certified to have an economy that fit the standards of what we define as a market economy. There were some other restrictions left over from the Cold War. A number of them, again, could be dealt with by presidential waiver authority. 10 years later, when we look at the raft of sanctions measures that the Congress passed this past year, the president, any president now has almost no bargaining room. So we have a series of sanctions on Russia that are locked in place in perpetuity. They can only be removed by another act of Congress. There is no waiver authority. And when you talk to members of Congress, they said, well, we had to pass this because we didn't trust President Trump. That was something you heard from both Republicans and Democrats. But they passed it in a way that pick whoever you would like to see in the White House next, whether it's President Marco Rubio or Nikki Haley or Kamala Harris or Cory Booker. They will be just as restricted as President Trump in terms of being able to offer concessions on the sanctions. They have almost no bargaining room. And so you have to go to the Russians and say, we'd like you to do certain things, and then we're going to go to Congress and ask them to lift the sanctions, which is probably going to be a much harder sell on getting the Congress to do that. So that wiggle room has disappeared. So that President Trump, successor to President Trump, now has a lot less executive authority to be able to offer certain carrots if the president decides that there was some sort of deal to be had with the Russians, whether on Ukraine, on Syria, on Iran, on North Korea. Final issue that has changed a great deal is 10 years ago, the image of Putin in the US, he had some issues that were beginning to develop. You had just had the death of Alexander Litvinenko in London from polonium poisoning, and some other people who were in the opposition. You had a whole string of people of mysterious deaths, poisoning, people happened to be shot, killed at random. So there was already some question about Putin's methods of governance and how he was running things. But there was still a general sense that he was someone that the United States can do business with. Today, with the exception perhaps of President Trump, there is nobody in Washington that really looks at President Putin as someone that the U.S. can do business with. And to the extent that the image is shifting so that essentially you have people on the Hill in particular, but in also parts of the executive branch saying you cannot have an effective relationship with Russia until there's been regime change in the Kremlin. Which runs up against the fact that Putin has just declared that he will seek re-election for a fourth term in 2018. When one looks at the list of presidential candidates who are running in Russia, it's hard to imagine that he will be unseated in that election or that he will be defeated. So the likelihood is that he'll get another term, whether he serves it out and then wants to do something else, or whether he'll try to engineer a succession, something certainly we can talk about in the questions. But for the foreseeable future, Putin will be running Russia. And if the attitude is that as long as he's running Russia, there can be no dealings with him, or, and this again is an outgrowth of the 2016 elections, what happened in the 2016 elections, if there is, at least for some, a sense that he needs to go before there can be any real improvement in U.S.-Russia relations, then that means for the foreseeable future there will be no improvement in U.S.-Russia relations because Putin doesn't plan to go anywhere. At least he will go on his timetable, not on America's timetable. So what this means, when we look at what's happened over this last year, is the Russians had an expectation based upon the campaign rhetoric of President Trump when he was candidate Trump, that he was going to try to seek pragmatic deals with Russia. And certainly Trump's first national security advisor, General Flynn, was floating ideas for could there be a series of quid pro quos where Russia would do things for the U.S. in certain areas, and the U.S. would do things for Russia, such as backtracking a bit on sanctions or moving things forward. When it became clear that the president, first of all, General Flynn lasted 23 days as national security advisor, was ultimately replaced by General McMaster, who does not share similar views on Russia. General McMaster has, over the last 6 to 8 months, been restructuring the National Security Council staff so that essentially all of the campaign people who were associated with the Trump campaign who went into the National Security Council are off it, or off the staff. Trump essentially made as a staffing decision, interestingly enough, that he did not equate in picking people for senior positions in the State Department and the Department of Defense did not really hold much of an ideological litmus test. That is, do you agree with me on policy issues? It was more, did you do things against me in the campaign that I didn't like? Or do I respect what you've done in the military or in the business world, and therefore want you part of my team? So you have a reality of the people that he's chosen for the State Department and the Defense Department, and then when we drop down to the level of who's in the key assistant secretary positions in both DOD and state, people frankly who could have been there in a Jeb Bush administration, Mitt Romney administration. These are not people who really fit the Russian engagement model, and they're the ones, therefore they're not inclined to move on this agenda. So the president kind of is on one corner, and then the rest of his administration is in another one. And so you don't really see much enthusiasm for proposing grand bargains or trying to seek out any of these quid pro quos with Russia. The Russians have realized this over the last year. They've watched the trajectory of their talks, particularly with Rex Tillerson, who, when it was first announced as Secretary of State, they said, ExxonMobil negotiated the deal with Rosneft, the Russian oil company. This is someone we can do business with. This is someone who will bring a business mentality to diplomacy. And every time Lavrov and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Minister, and Rex Tillerson have met, the engagements have been worse and worse. So much so that Lavrov apparently has said that he actually feels he got along much better with John Kerry than he does with Rex Tillerson. At least with John Kerry, they had common ground and they could try to work together. With Tillerson, there's no meeting. And therefore there's no grounds for bargaining, which the Russians now interpret as if there's no grounds for bargaining. If the president has no waiver authority, he has no leverage, if he can't offer any carrots, if all he can essentially do at this point is try to, and which the president has done, he has delayed implementation of sticks. So the sanctions that were passed against Russia by Congress had a number of things that were mandatory, and then they had some things which were the president is given the power to. He hasn't followed through on some of these. In some cases, because he hasn't staffed the appropriate offices. So the real test will be what's known as the Oligarchs Report. Congress has mandated that the State Department produce a study of all major Russian business figures and assess their connections to the Kremlin and therefore the extent to which they should be sanctioned. That report is supposed to be delivered February of 2018. I have my doubts that it's going to be done on time, or it'll just, if it's done, it'll be very haphazard and superficial. The president is also under pressure to start applying sanctions against third countries, companies of third countries that do business with Russia. This has the particular problem of perhaps creating complications with our relationships, particularly with Germany, and Italy, Japan, and Turkey, where there are continued dealings with Russian energy and defense firms. There's talk that there'll be another round of sanctions legislation moving through in the coming year. And the president doesn't seem that he's going to invest, as he did the last time, he's not going to invest political capital to stop it. He's not going to veto, in part because if he vetoes, his veto will be overridden, and he doesn't want to look like a loser. So you don't veto something knowing that it's going to get passed over your veto, so you sign it. And as with previous presidents, he just did this yesterday with the National Defense Authorization Act. He attached a signing statement. There were some things about Russia policy where he says, I'm going to treat these as advisory because you can't tell me how to do my Article 2 duties as Commander-in-Chief. So he signed it, but one of the things was on Crimea. He says, I'll take this under advisement, but I don't consider it binding on me. What the Russians now realize is that the president is not going to exert himself to try to block things. He has very little leverage to offer substantive carrots to the Russians. And so now there is a definite growing faction within the Kremlin that says, not necessarily to be anti-American for the sake of being anti-American, but it's just time for Russia to do the things that Russia wants to do, and whether the U.S. likes them or not should no longer be a consideration in Russian foreign policy. So Russian intervention in Syria, Russian relations with Iran, Russian connections with North Korea, Russian activity in Ukraine and in other parts of Europe. The metric is no longer, as it was even in earlier iterations of the Putin and then Medvedev administration, what's the cost we might pay in Washington if we do do this. Now it's, Washington is not a factor. If it's if we deem it in our interest to do something, we will do it. There's also a sense in Moscow that the United States needs to be bogged down. And I remember this because I remember this from 10 years ago when I was here in Stanford. And this calculus has not changed. 10 years ago, I related the comment of a senior Russian advisor who was asked, well, why aren't you doing, he was asked by Bush administration, why aren't you doing more to help us with Iran and Iraq? You know, we can solve problems. And he said, we want you to stay in Iraq forever, because as long as you're enmeshed in the Middle East, you can't focus on us. And that logic is only intensified. That if the United States is distracted in the Middle East, if it's distracted with North Korea, why should Russia help solve those problems for the United States if it means that then the United States is going to be free to focus its full attention on Russia? So Russia is adopting the position of a spoiler. It's not going to actively, it's not going to ally with North Korea, for instance, or do anything, but it's not going to do anything, it's not going to go out of its way to help the US get through any of these issues. So the United States has been focusing a lot on China, for example, with North Korea, and the Chinese have responded. Yes, we're cutting off sources and we're not buying things, and what's happened is this stuff quietly migrates through Russia. So Chinese bank stops giving credit, but a Russian bank in Vladivostok is giving credit. Or the Chinese aren't buying coal from North Korea, but the Russians are buying it and then shipping it to China, or other things like that. So we've put a lot of effort on focusing on the China relationship, and then the Russians spoil some of the things that we're trying to do there. Where there is some potential light at the tunnel on these things is that Russia has shown that if its other partners ask it to do something, they might be more inclined. So some of the things that Russia has done with North Korea are done because Japan, which is forging a strategic relationship with Russia, will go, Prime Minister Abe will ask Putin, can you do certain things? Or in the case of the Middle East, this newfound Russian-Saudi relationship that has emerged over the last year, particularly over the last several months. The Saudis go to the Russians and say, really, can you do some things with Iran? And the Israelis as well. Benjamin Netanyahu has a closer relationship with Putin, certainly than he did with President Obama. And it's a toss-up whether or not it's a closer relationship than he has with President Trump. But he definitely, Netanyahu also goes to the Russians and say, can you do certain things to restrain or hold back the Iranians? And one of those practical areas is when the Israelis strike in Syria, they strike Iranian convoys. You notice that there's never any problems with the Russian air defenses in Syria, or the Russian Air Force flying missions in Syria, because the Israelis go and say to the Russians, we see this convoy moving to Lebanon, we're going to hit it. And the Russians are, well, we'll just pretend as if we're not noticing anything, and then there's a... And so what you have is you have partners that can get the Russians to do things, but in turn, those countries are now telling the United States, we're worried about you continually sanctioning the Russians, and that then creates problems for our leverage. So the Germans, I just got back from a week in Germany for a US-German dialogue. The Germans are very concerned that our approach to Russia is not taking into account some of these other variables. The Israelis, the Saudis have openly said they're not going to join US sanctions on Russia because they want to be able to preserve their leverage with Russia to balance Iran. The Japanese continue with some sanctions on Russia. They're very reluctant about them. They'd like to be doing more. And again, they've signaled as well that we need Russia on North Korea. And Japan also would like Russia not to be driven further into China's embrace. It's not in Japan's interest to have the China-Russia strategic partnership consummated completely. So the Japanese want to be able to offer an alternative to the Russians, and if they're being pressured by the US for further sanctions, there comes a point at which they may say no more. So the Russians are being very adept at trying to exploit some of the differences between the United States and its allies and partners by suggesting that, well, if we can't work with the United States, perhaps we can still reach accommodations with our German allies and partners, our Italian friends, our newfound Saudi and Israeli friends, and with the Japanese, and then of course continuing their strategic partnerships with Iran and China as well. So we're going to see how all that diplomacy plays out. Some of the things to look for in the coming year. As I said, I don't see the relationship getting better. I can't see the grounds by which President Trump and President Putin could have a major summit meeting and be able to produce deliverables, simply because that list of deliverables would be dead on arrival when he returned to the United States. There's no way the Congress would support it. He would have significant resistance within his own party, within his own administration. We saw this in the run-up to the summit in Vietnam. Initially, Trump wanted to have a full-fledged formal meeting with Putin. His advisors downgraded that to an informal sideline chat in Vietnam, precisely because they didn't want to have to go through and develop a whole, they didn't want to have the president begin signing agenda items that then would be dead on arrival here. The president apparently promised Putin in Vietnam that he would push for a major Russian-American summit to be held at some indeterminate point in the future. So far, I haven't heard of any planning that's taking place about where a meeting would take place, what the agenda would be, how it would be carried out. And again, that reflects the sense that the United States doesn't feel that it can offer anything to Russia, or that Russia is not prepared to do anything that would warrant the United States to do that. We had in Belgrade last month the special envoy of the Secretary of State, Kurt Volker, on Ukraine, meeting with his Russian counterpart, Vladislav Surkov. That meeting, there was some hope that that might produce some positive momentum. Volker brought, I think it was 23 agenda items on Ukraine, and Surkov said 20 out of the 23 were non-starters. And that maybe 3 of them, there might be room that they could talk about, but everything else was off the agenda. So that was another kind of, we're nowhere near having any kind of thing moving forward. So what are the things to look for going in? First of all, what happens with the Russian elections? How much fraud is needed to make the elections? Putin apparently has said he wants 70% turnout and a 70%, he'd like to hit the 70-70. So I want 70% voter turnout and I want 70% of the vote. So the question is how much of that will happen organically? That is, because Putin still has reserves of popular support. But if it's 40 and 35, how much will that have to be inflated? And again, how are the elections perceived? I think in our country, we're not going to look at any election in Russia and say that he has a mandate or that he has a democratic mandate, and that won't help. But it also depends on how this plays out in Russia, how it's seen in Russia, whether or not people just sort of shrug and say, our vote doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter, and this is just the way it is. To what extent what's known as the non-systemic opposition either rallies around the candidacy of Putin's goddaughter, interestingly enough, so Ksenia Sobchak, who is the daughter of the former mayor of St. Petersburg, who was Putin's law professor in the university, and then Putin worked for him in the 90s as the vice mayor. She is running presidential candidate as a presidential candidate and is supposed to be rallying the reform forces, the young. To what extent that's seen as an actual legitimate platform, and to what extent this is just for show. And again, the fact that she's Putin's goddaughter, maybe she's broken with her godfather, maybe she hasn't, but that does. It also shows, again, these connections in the Russian elite are often deeper than we sometimes perceive. That's the first test. What happens March 2018? Second major test for us is Germany does not have a government. No party won a majority in the elections to the Bundestag. In the elections, no one in Germany wants a new election because they're afraid that if the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, is the third largest party now, if you hold elections again in Germany, will they get a larger mandate? So no one wants to go to new elections. The negotiations are on among the various parties about how a new government will be structured. Of the parties that are in the talks, so Angela Merkel, as Chancellor of Germany, has tended personally, because of her own background, having grown up in East Germany, and then also feeling personally betrayed by Putin in 2014, where he gave her assurances about Ukraine that he then didn't follow through on. She has taken that as a personal affront, that he is not trustworthy. So she has been the real motive force for Germany imposing sanctions on Russia, keeping the sanctions. The other parties in Germany don't necessarily share that enthusiasm. In particular, if the Social Democrats go into the German coalition, then you will see a number of projects with Russia, particularly pipeline projects, back on track, because the German business community sees Russia as one of its major markets. Germany wants to have energy security. They don't like that their energy still goes through Ukraine, part of it, and they would like to get all of their energy directly from Russia. So depending on how the German government goes, we'll see how that plays out. Third is what happens in Ukraine. We've had some political turbulence in Ukraine over the last couple of days. The current president is facing some political heat on corruption issues. Some of his political allies are turning against him. You have instability in Ukraine. If you have a resumption of fighting in Ukraine, that can be blamed on the Ukrainians. This is an important step, because if you have that, then you have about 5 or 6 countries in Europe that said, well, if Ukraine is starting fighting against the Russians in Ukraine, then let's take the sanctions off Russia. The sanctions were just renewed. The European Commission renewed them at the to take into effect in January for another 6 months. Whichever number of countries would like those sanctions removed. So if Merkel is weakened in Germany, and if there is disorder in Ukraine that gives countries like Italy or Slovakia or Hungary an excuse to not renew the sanctions, then you could have movement forward on that. So we'll see. We have to see how that goes forward. And then finally, of course, what happens here, what happens with the progress of the Russia investigation, what happens with control of Congress, particularly after our 2018 midterms, and to the extent that Congress decides that it will continue to impose new penalties on Russia, and in imposing new penalties on Russia to take away executive waiver action, and therefore to deprive the president, or any president of that matter, of the ability to use sanctions as a leverage to try to get concessions down the road. So we'll see how all this plays out. As I said at the beginning, I'm not optimistic. I think that for the foreseeable future, the relationship is going to be poor. All the areas where people have said there could be cooperation between Russia and the United States, either the issues are small potatoes. We can work together in the Arctic to make sure that ships don't founder. We can keep working on the space station together. Those aren't really big issues. And on some of the other ones, Middle East, what happens in Northeast Asia, there just is not, Russia doesn't have an incentive right now to work with the United States to produce solutions. They would rather see the United States embroiled, and so they'll continue to act as a spoiler. So maybe 10 years from now, George, I'll be back again, and then I'll give you a different story. But my decennial report to Stanford on the U.S.-Russia relationship is that it's not good. And with that, why don't I go ahead and take questions?
If you would just wait to microphone.
Yeah. You want to go ahead? Why don't you select?
Start in the rear.
People and...
Thank you for your comments. What's going on domestically in Russia that drives a lot of these actions outside of Russia? If I recall correctly, they have a disproportionately sizable reliance on oil exports. And so that's obviously a factor. But what else is going on inside their economy that enables them to be stable or not?
It's a great question. So Russia is still primarily a resource exporter in its economy. Oil, natural gas, minerals, lumber. The agricultural sector has rebounded in recent years, so Russia is also now a food exporter to the rest of the world, particularly in the Middle East. There's some important connections there that Russia is feeding Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other places that can't feed themselves entirely. And then, of course, the legacy industries of the Soviet Union, which Russia still has, which are nuclear power, missiles, and the arms sectors. So the Russian economy is affected by resource pricing and energy prices in particular. When oil prices are up, natural gas prices go up, therefore more money comes into Russia because Russia has a windfall tax for companies that export, so anything above, when the oil price is above $27 a barrel, much of that additional oil price is absorbed by the state as income. So energy prices being high is a good thing for the, you have more money to spend, and so you want to ensure that energy prices stay high. And you can do that a number of ways. You can work, as the Russians are now working with the Saudis, to kind of control production and keep oil prices in a stable band. You discourage countries from adopting alternative energy. One of the successful understudied Russian campaigns has been the Russian ability to work with environmental movements to stop shale gas and oil production in various parts of Europe, starting with Romania, because then you eliminate competition there. The anti-nuclear movement has been very good for Russia, so Germany is nicely locked in because Germany is committed to zero emissions, which means you can't burn coal. German parties, particularly the Greens, don't like nuclear power, particularly after Fukushima, so that pretty much leaves natural gas as your only option. And where you're going to get your gas from, you'll get it from Russia. So you can build it. So they have incentives building in to try to keep their energy markets there. The intervention in Syria was one of the best advertisements for the Russian defense program. Its industries. Orders are up around the world because Russia demonstrated everything from jets to cruise missiles to helicopters to all sorts of equipment. So India is buying, China's buying, Algeria is buying, Vietnam is buying, Middle Eastern countries are buying, the Turks are buying, NATO ally buying S-400 systems. So the Russian intervention in Syria, I'm not saying that they went into, as the primary goal was not to showcase the Russian defense industry, but they've certainly benefited from that. And they certainly benefit, so when you then look at the Russian economy, so they need stable energy prices, and higher energy prices the better. That drives some of their foreign policy, things that will keep energy prices high, things that will undercut competition. And Russia's ability to offer military equipment and atomic power to countries that want it who can't get it from the United States. So Saudis want more atomic power. We might get a little antsy. Jordan wants it. Other countries. We might get a little antsy saying, we really don't want you to have a nuclear reactor. So they go to the Russians. Iraq had a shopping list for weaponry. Some of it, the U.S. said, nope, we're not going to supply this. They went to the Russians. So the Russians are good at then saying, all right, look around the world. When we say we don't want you to have atomic power, we don't want you to have a missile program, we don't want you to have these types of weaponry, the Russians now say, we're open for business, and this helps to sustain those sectors. The Russian defense industry has gotten a real shot in the arm over the last couple of years, both because the increase in energy prices give a lot more money for the Russian Ministry of Defense to spend, but because they're selling so much more around the world, and that's helping to pay for research and development and new production. So the Russians now have structural incentives to, as I said, keep energy prices up, and in some ways that means, hey, the Middle East is a little unstable, that's good, because oil traders like to price in a little bit higher if they think that there's a problem there. And if they look around the world and see that there are conflict areas that, well, that's business. And the Russians, by the way, are very good at selling to both sides. And so, your case in point, India and China. India and China still don't like each other. They still have a disputed border. They face each other. They're both buying large amounts of Russian weaponry, as Vietnam is too. And Vietnam isn't buying Russian weaponry to use against Thailand. You know where that Russian weaponry is going, and it's going, looking north of the border. So the Russians are happy to do it. So they have. When we're talking about Russia being a spoiler, it's not just that Putin wakes up in the morning and says, I really want to stick it to the United States, although I sometimes think he thinks that now. But there are structural economic things which say being a spoiler is not only psychologically satisfying against the United States, it actually serves a number of core Russian economic interests as well.
We'll alternate sides.
Okay?
Wendy, go ahead.
Can you envision any scenario where the Russians will ever leave Crimea or to go against?
Russia leaving Crimea I can't envision one right now. At least under the current Russian administration, with the current Russian incentives, I can't see that they would give Crimea up. It is part and parcel of Putin's claim to be the first Russian leader since Gorbachev to increase the size of Russia. If you think of the Soviet Union collapse as a diminishment of Russia, now he has increased the size. Enormous boost he got in 2015 from that. But strategically, control of the Crimea now means that Russia effectively controls the Black Sea Basin. It is, when one looks at the military facilities in Crimea, the ability to project power, combined with Russia's new friendship with Turkey, means Russia returns to the Eastern Mediterranean as a power, and now the Russians are upgrading their bases in Syria, they're negotiating for bases in Egypt, and they're probably going to get bases now in Libya again. So Russia returns to the Mediterranean as a power. All of that depends on control of Crimea. And the Russians are rerouting. They're investing a great deal to route around Ukraine and to create the economic linkages that will connect Crimea. They conceive of Crimea right now as an island. They're going to link it to the Russian mainland to the east, and they're spending billions of dollars, and you're not going to spend billions of dollars in that types of investment to turn it over. The Russians may be open to a situation where they buy Crimea, and that was a plan that was sort of floated earlier this year. This kind of Trump's lawyer and this Ukrainian lawmaker and some mysterious Russian businessman said, well, can the Russians get a perpetual lease on Crimea, and what they would pay for it? The Russians might go for something like that, but barring collapse of the current regime and pretty much collapse of Russia itself, I don't see them leaving Crimea. We may not recognize it, and in some ways we don't have to, because the example that the Russians are using, and they have their Turkish partners to thank for this example, is Cyprus. Turks have been in northern Cyprus since 1974. No one recognizes it, but it's a reality that the northern third of Cyprus is the Turkish Republic, is something that Turkey runs, and no one recognizes it. There's no one acknowledges it, but it's a fact on the ground. And so the Russians can live with that. They don't need us to recognize Crimea. They like it. If the United States said, yes, we recognize the transfer, we recognize the referendum as legitimate and all of that, but even if we don't, we just do nothing about it, they can live with that. So, but yeah, I don't see the Russians leaving. I think that's from their perspective. And when you talk to Russians, they say this is non-negotiable. Donbass, the rest of Ukraine, all of that is negotiable. Crimea is not. At least so the current team says we're not even going to talk Crimea. So from our perspective then is, do we start with it in our relationship with Russia? Do we say you've got to settle Crimea first and then everything else? Or do we say we don't agree with you on Crimea, we're going to take that issue and put it to the side and then work something else? And again, in our policy process, we don't have an answer to that either, because the NDAA that Congress passed yesterday wants to make the Crimea issue front and center. And Tillerson essentially said that in Brussels, that the Ukraine issue as a whole is at the center of the U.S.-Russia relationship. So someone will blink on that. Right now, no one's blinking. A year or 2 years, we'll see where that goes.
What about Mr. Navalny? Will he be allowed to run for president, and if so, will he be allowed to use the media?
No, he won't be allowed to run for president. He will be disqualified in the fact that he's a felon. He's a convicted felon, and therefore is ineligible to run. That will be the pretext used. He may still try to run, have people write him in. He will not get access to the broadcast media, except when the broadcast media wants to paint him as an agent of foreign powers or the like. His reach through the internet is more, he has more of a reach through that he can get people to focus on it. But again, the question is if he gets 10, 15, 20%, either for him or if Sobchak essentially runs as the Navalny candidate, which again, given her background and her connections, whether or not she's doing that at the Kremlin's behest to kind of be the Trojan candidate. The question is, will anyone think it makes a difference? And the Kremlin is happy to have people be apathetic. People are supportive, great, but as long as they're not in active opposition, they can live with it. And Navalny has been is a steam valve. His protests attract people. The Kremlin is somewhat concerned about the generational impact of Navalny's protests, which is when one looks at who goes to a Navalny protest for the preponderance of 20-somethings, teens and 20-somethings, so that the question is, does he have a hold on the next generation? But the other thing that the Kremlin will be looking at is whether or not how this affects what's known as the systemic opposition. So in Russia, there are opposition parties. There are 3 opposition parties. They are much like the way opposition parties used to run in Mexico from 1917 until the 1990s. That is, that you're allowed to run, you can have candidacies, you can have a platform, but you pretty much function within the rules of the ruling party. You get assigned, hey, you can have so many seats, you can get to say certain things. The question is, does Navalny's movement begin to infect where people go in and say we're going to use the systemic opposition to try to move that into a more non-systemic way, and the jury's out. The real question is Moscow, opposition forces did manage to get seats in the Moscow City Council in the last municipal election. And so is there a question that could be, is it containable? Will it expand beyond? We don't know. There is one school of thought with Navalny, though, this again goes back to wonderful Russian conspiratorial thinking that says even that Navalny himself, why hasn't he been arrested and really dealt with? Well, is he doing things because he's actually doing it somewhere at the behest of one of the Kremlin clans, too? Because when you look at who Navalny goes after, he goes after different groups within the Kremlin, but not all of them. And he particularly has gone after Medvedev, the prime minister. So the great conspiratorial thinking in Russian politics is, does that mean that another Kremlin clan is quietly backing him to use Navalny as a way to get rid of? Because Medvedev, who is the prime minister, he is right now, if something happens to Putin, he becomes the acting president. So whoever the prime minister is often seen as the de facto successor, and there's a lot of talk that after the March 2018 elections, Medvedev will no longer be prime minister. Someone else will be moved out. So has Navalny's movement been useful at knocking Medvedev down a couple pegs by one of his oppositions? And again, this is the conspiratorial approach to Kremlin and Russian politics that sees everyone as having some hidden agenda, but it remains to be seen how that plays out.
Thank you. In his discussion of Russia in the book World Order, Henry Kissinger points out that the Russian Empire historically has never been static, that it's either expanding or contracting. My question is, to what degree does that point of view shape the foreign policy of Russia and the United States? Russia feeling that the expansion of NATO is encroaching on their sphere of influence, and the U.S. sees the interventions in Georgia and Ukraine as evidence of expansion.
I mean, John Kerry and he wasn't wrong in using this characterization after the incursion into Ukraine, where he said, well, Russia is 19th century and the U.S. is 21st century, right? So 21st century, we are all about networks and globalism, and 19th century is about spheres of influence, and you take the map and you draw the lines, and 19th century approach says it's Melian dialogue. The smaller powers pretty much have to accept what the bigger powers dish out for them, and what you do is like at Vienna or Berlin, the great powers come together, they pull out the map, they draw the lines. This is yours, this is ours, this is neutral. This is the arrangement. That's an approach the Russians are comfortable with. They've always tried to get the U.S. to sign off on that. Putin tried in the months after 9/11. to say war on terror, the US will lead this global war on terror, and Russia will handle the Eurasian space. So, give us our sphere of influence and we'll keep order there for you, and you can go after Al-Qaeda. And we kind of said, no, it's not how we do business. This is the approach the Russians are taking in the Middle East right now with the Saudis and the Iranians. Wouldn't it just be better if Saudi Arabia and Iran kind of sat down and drew out the map and assigned spheres of influence? And that's a way that the Russians like to see the world. Where it comes to what it means for Russia itself is the Russians still have this view of great powers have a sphere of influence around them. Great powers should be able not to take over their neighbors, but should be able to have influence in what their neighbors do. And we look at that and say, that's not 21st century, that's not how the world should work. Countries should be free to make their own political and economic decisions. What is interesting is the extent to which Russia is making this argument in Beijing, and Beijing is considering it. Because the Chinese are looking at the world, and the Chinese, of course, would like a good relationship with the United States, but also believe that there's a good chance that in the coming 20 years they will have a clash with the United States. That as a rising power, us as a status quo / declining power, sooner or later we're going to fight. And therefore, is it in China's interests to essentially say we want our Eurasian backdoor taken care of, and Russia is the country to do it, because Russia will keep the United States out. We don't want to suddenly wake up one day and have American bases in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan hitting Xinjiang and cutting off our land routes and affecting things. So the Russians have essentially tried to modify this for a 21st century to tie it to the whole Eurasian Silk Road, One Belt, One Road, and Eurasian Economic Union. So the Russians are adapting, and they're not talking about empire, they're talking about the Eurasian Union, right? Which is another way of saying here's Russia, and here's a series of Eurasian countries, and Russia will order them and will create a stable boundary between China, the China sphere in the east, and Europe in the west. Partly it's also to get the Europeans to say we're done expanding to the east, right? Draw the line at the Vistula and the Baltic, and that's it, that Europe is done. Europeans are divided on whether or not they're finished enlarging or not. They have a problem with enlargement fatigue. The Chinese are also wrestling, is this a good deal for China? But the Russians are making their pitch. They know that the US won't accept it. They're trying to see is there a receptive audience in Europe, and more importantly in China. And what do the Chinese think? And do the Chinese think that this is good for China? Hey, Russian hegemony over the Eurasian space. And partly is, does China feel that it can exercise it? I mean, why would you need Russia to do it if you think you can do it yourself? But that's one reason. Again, historical patterns. The Soviet Union had this problem with Japan, and the way the Soviet Union solved that problem was to tell Japan, look south and east. And it does bear telling that when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they did also not declare war on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't enter the war against Japan until August 1945. And so, hey, we can do that with China, right? Don't worry about Xinjiang, Central Asia, worry about the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And by the way, we've got your back if you have a problem with the United States. That's part of the current Russian strategy. And again, it goes back to this thing about spoilers, right? So if US-China relations are unsettled, that benefits Russia. So Russia has no incentive to, at this stage in the game, to really make the US-China relationship work. The more that there's tension between the US and China, the better that serves Russian strategic interests.
Okay, over here.
Throughout your speech, you sort of painted Russia and the US as at a stalemate. But what do you think that the US could do that would directly increase the tension between the nations?
Yeah, there's a number of things the US could do. And this is an interesting discussion, and it's why things like World Affairs Forum and the World Affairs Councils are useful. Because there's one thing it's for strategists in Washington, you can come up with all sorts of ways. The problem is then you've got to get buy-in from the American people. So there's a lot we could do to really stir things up with Russia. We could go for permanent basing in the Baltic states. It's start putting, not, right now we're rotational. We send people in, they leave, we could go for permanent things there. We could decide, yeah, we're going to bring Ukraine into NATO. We're going to give them an accelerated membership action program, or that the U.S. will do a direct security treaty with NATO, with the Ukraine, because NATO works on consensus. We're going to ask the Ukrainians to allow us to station forces in Odessa. We are going to do sectoral sanctions on the Russian economy. You know, right now we have a selection of what we would call smart sanctions. Now we're just going to go, no Russian use of the dollar. The problem is that then what we've seen in our sanctions policy is that the U.S. government has tended to put sanctions on Russia that the American business community and general population can live with. Because we could really increase the economic pain that Russia pays, but then there's going to start to be a price that America pays as well. And there's no political consensus here for doing that. People may not like Russia, but there's not a sense that Russia is an existential threat to the U.S. So if you go out and say we have to stop the Russians now, because if we don't, we're going to be fighting them in New York, they're not even going to go to Berlin, right? So it's not even a question of stop the Russians today. So you can't get it's hard to go out and get people mobilized for measures against Russia if they think that they're going to start paying a cost at home. So all of our sanctions now are enough to put pressure on Russia without really causing too much damage to the American economy. If you go for sectoral sanctions, for instance, first of all, you're going to create real ruptures with the Europeans, because the Europeans won't vote for them. You also run the risk of pushing Russia further along the path of stopping to use the American dollar, which on the one hand, it's a tool of influence we have, but on the other hand, we benefit so much from the dollar as a global currency. So it's what allows us to run deficits without paying the price. Means right now, when we have a deficit, the Federal Reserve says we're going to release another couple $1 billion of U.S. currency into global markets, and everyone buys it up because they want to keep the value of the dollar. We don't want a situation, we've always stopped short of getting a situation where Russia and China and other countries are incentivized to stop using the dollar. If we increase our sanctions on Russia, that is a risk. Outgoing Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew, raised that in the last days of the Obama administration. People said, why aren't you doing more? Pressure Russia more, pressure China more. And he said, there's a point at which we're trying to thread a balance. We don't want to screw up the position of the dollar in the world economy. And so we don't like Russia, but we also like the dollar. So there's a trade-off there. With the military thing, we might want to have guys in the Baltic states. Are we willing to cede South China Sea to the Chinese? We only have so many assets. We can only put so much in so many areas. So we're rotating people around. And so some of it would also force us to decide what our priorities are. So we could say Russia is the #1 geopolitical threat, and then reorient to meet that threat, but then we might have to live with things in the Middle East and Asia that we don't like. And partly it goes to a sense of how we set our national security priorities as well. So yeah, if Russia was the only problem, we could do a lot more, and we could pressure them a lot more, but it's the question of the trade-offs that we're willing to pay. And the Trump administration, because of its internal division between the president and his national security team, doesn't have a unified answer to that yet.
Unfortunately, that has to be the last word. We have to conclude. Thank you very much. Would you all please join me in thanking the speaker this evening?